Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. We'll take a minute or two for everyone to gather, but while we do so, I just want to welcome everyone today. This is a webinar on 5 myths of endowment management. And on behalf of the Episcopal Parish Network and its Executive Director, Joe Swimmer, thank you for joining us today. Joe isn't able to be here. He's on a plane, but I saw him typing in there in the chat box for a moment before takeoff, I think. So thank you to Joe, thank you to EPN, and thank you also to the Episcopal Parish Network for holding webinars and conferences that inform all of us who are working to support Episcopal churches. My name is Karsten Sierk. I am the Director of Endowment Management at the Episcopal Church Foundation, or ECF, and my fellow presenter today is Anne Richardson, ECF's Senior Program Director for Investor Relations. This webinar is being recorded, and I think that EPN will make it available or post it on its website, actually, I suspect, afterwards, in case it's of interest to anybody else at your church or organization. So Anne and I would like to start today with some context. Many Episcopal churches have an endowment. Some wish they had an endowment. And yet at the Episcopal Church Foundation, or ECF, we have learned from our conversations over many years with hundreds of churches of all kinds all across the country that there are plenty of misconceptions about what an endowment can do, and what an endowment is and what an endowment can do. So today, Anne and I are going to clear up some of these myths, and along the way, we will also cover some of the basic principles of good endowment management at Episcopal churches. Then this is all a lead-in to EPN's conference in March in Jacksonville, Florida. So we hope we see some of you again there in March. And when we do, we will be joined by a number of other presenters at the endowment pre-conference there. And at that point, we will, with this good context today, we will be all ready together as a larger group to jump into topics of particular interest today in a changing church. So welcome again, everyone. I'd like to start simply with the definition of an endowment. So we all use the word endowment, of course, but technically speaking, there are 2 types. And it's important to know what type you have, most of all, because it may affect how much you can spend each year. So first there, on the left, we see a permanent endowment. This is what many people think of when they hear the word endowment. These are funds given by a donor. The donor has indicated that these funds are to last in perpetuity. Somehow, the donor has indicated, somehow, there's a little bit of feedback or sound on the audio. I don't want to disrupt other people. So perhaps if everyone could mute themselves while we're presenting and then unmute for questions, that might help. Thanks. So just there on the 3rd bullet there, great. So the donor has indicated in some way that these funds are not wholly expendable on a current basis. No donors actually, I'm having a lot of feedback here on the sound. I don't know if it's me. Slightly concerned it's me, but we'll go from there. Hopefully it's not bothering anybody else. Let's just see that. Okay, great. So these are funds given by a donor. They're meant to last in perpetuity. The donor indicates that these funds are not wholly expendable on a current basis. No donor is actually going to say that to you, but somehow in the documentation around their gift, they will indicate this with words like, this fund is to last in perpetuity, or the church is to spend income only, or the church must protect the principal or protect the corpus. That is signaling the donor's intent. State law protects these gifts. That's very important to keep in mind. And you may spend from them only in a prudent manner. Only prudent spending is allowed. We'll come back to that. But what I also want to add is this is not part of the formal definition, but in the minds of many donors, this is their living legacy, their legacy to their church to sustain their memory, and also, of course, to sustain the church on into the future. So by contrast, we have what we call a quasi-endowment. Some of you may hear the phrase a vestry designated endowment or funds functioning as an endowment. So these are funds set aside by the vestry for long-term use. They may include donor gifts to the church. For example, if someone just leaves a bequest to St. Mary's Church, nothing more than that, the church can do whatever it wants with it. But here, obviously, it's very good practice and strongly encouraged for the vestry to set aside that bequest for the long term and put it into a quasi-endowment fund. A church could also gain funds for a quasi-endowment with any excess funds that they have. And the first time I put that in a presentation, everyone laughed and said, what church has excess funds? But that may happen. Let's say you have a rectory, you sell the rectory, you are able to then make new use of those funds, perhaps an annual clergy housing stipend or some such, but that becomes excess funds. We've worked recently with a couple of churches, believe it or not, who've been able to lease a portion of their property for a cell phone tower. They get a lump sum payment, voila, all of a sudden they also have excess funds. So when you have these types of funds, you set them aside for the long term. This is a quasi-endowment. Prudent investing is required by state law, and typically church policy is also to spend prudently, but there's a little bit more leeway to spend a little bit more deeply in special circumstances or under whatever criteria you set for yourself. Often permanent endowment funds and quasi-endowment funds are invested together, right? They're both long-term. You just might track them separately and spend from them separately. So, and that actually gets to sort of a broader point. When we use the word endowment in the singular, it actually means a collection of funds. Your endowment may very well be made up of several different funds or have several sources of funding, and you will want to be sure you know the source of each fund, whether there are restrictions on the use of those funds. We'll talk more about restrictions in a moment, but making sure you understand your funds is always a great place to start if you are new on an investment committee. So I'd like to turn now to our first myth out of 5 of them. Myth number 1. Endowments are only for large churches. This is not true. Most endowments start with an unexpected gift from a donor, and that gift is unlikely to have anything to do with how big or how wealthy a church is. Instead, it typically reflects how much the donor cares about the church. It reflects that donor's emotional commitment to their church, and that type of care and commitment can develop in both small churches and in large churches. These gifts are often a bequest in a will, and I'll note who goes in a will: your family members, and then perhaps a particularly meaningful charity. like a church. So at the Episcopal Church Foundation, we talk all the time with small churches with large endowments and with small churches with small endowments that make an impact, which is, of course, the first good step to gaining new gifts and developing a large endowment, in addition to all the conversations that we have with the classic large endowed church. The basic concept of an endowment, as we discussed a moment ago, is the same, regardless of the size of the church or the size of the gift. These are funds set aside for the long term by a donor or by a vestry, perhaps with restrictions. And sort of the key point, they are intended to support a church both in the present day and in the future. And it's securing that balance between the present and the future that is probably the most important concept behind an endowment. So you might be asking, can you increase your chance of getting an endowment gift? And I will say why. Yes, you can. And you can. And again, both small churches and large churches will want to do the same things to gain new endowment gifts. Number one, raise awareness of what an endowment is, and importantly, how it can make a difference. And then number two, build trust amongst the congregation that your church is a worthy recipient of their long-term gift. So here are some questions now for you to consider at your own church. Let's first cover churches that already have an endowment. How can your current investment manager make it easier for you to oversee your funds? And is it time to reconsider your committee or your manager? No matter your size, endowment management is easy with the right investment partner. So there are three things you're going to want to consider around that. Number one, you want to be able to make the big strategic decisions about your endowment yourself, right? You all know the church best. You make the big decisions about what the endowment is intended to accomplish at the church, and then you outsource day-to-day investment management to an outside manager. So the question is, do you have the guidance you need from your manager to make the key decisions that relate to your overall goals for your funds? Number two, to think about as you're thinking about, is my current investment partner the right one for us? You want good reports. Goes without saying, but you'd be surprised, not everybody provides those. You should be having account statements, of course, and performance reports that include benchmarked returns. So it's your portfolio performance return compared to a benchmark. This is because you need to oversee your manager, and you have to have information from them to be able to do that. And number three, be sure you understand the fees you pay. If this information is hard to get or hard to understand, then find a manager who makes it easy for you. Overall, I think here, when you're overseeing an endowment at a church, you do not have to be an investment wizard. You just have to be sensible and responsible. And really, my personal opinion, but I'll stand by it, is you have to be able to communicate well with others. So now, if you don't yet have an endowment, or perhaps you have an endowment, but it's not really the one you want, and you want to create a new endowment fund, go ahead and get ready. Develop endowment policies that show how you would manage an endowment. That helps build the trust that I mentioned on the prior slide. And start to make your case for endowment gifts. So that's raising awareness of what endowment gifts can make possible, or perhaps have already made possible at your church. But remember, all of this is done sort of with this eye towards the emotional connections that members of your congregation have. And that spirit about it is the same, regardless of whether you're a large church or a small church. So now I would like to turn to a related myth. Endowment governance is complex and time-consuming. This is also not true. So first, a church can simply own its endowment funds directly. It can place them with an investment firm of some kind in an account that is labeled with the church's name. Nothing fancier than that is needed. Second, a church can appoint a small investment committee to oversee the endowment funds. It may also choose to give that responsibility to an existing finance committee. But if that's the way you choose to proceed, I encourage you to give very clear direction to a finance committee, which overall is responsible for day-to-day, year-to-year budget issues, that its investment oversight, its endowment oversight is a separate responsibility with a long-term perspective. But basically, you just designate several people at the church to oversee the endowment regularly. And number three, a church can adopt a simple set of endowment policies and guidelines that lay out the purpose of the fund, how it should be invested, and how it may be spent. Then there's perfect clarity for both your manager and for everyone overseeing the funds. And the policies should also include guidelines in case you get new gifts. We call those our gift acceptance policies. And with a well-managed endowment that you talk about effectively at your church, you are indeed likely to get additional endowment gifts. So the key with oversight, which is what makes it not complex and not time-consuming, is to follow a disciplined oversight process. And again, with this type of process, a committee need not include only investment professionals, can reach a little bit more widely into the church. So here are a few questions for you to consider now at your church. Do you need to review your endowment practices or update your funds or your documents? Do a little self-assessment. Does your investment committee function well? Do you meet regularly? In fact, do people show up? Do you get new members? And that actually leads to the third bullet there. Do you have a succession plan for investment committee members? So I encourage you to talk with others at your church about these issues. Find out what is in writing at the church and what's just the accepted practice. And then think about what you want to set up or to have as a ready reference to guide you and your current committee as well as future committee members. There are good standards for this type of oversight. There are best practices. There are plenty of examples. And what you need may be pretty similar to what others are doing too, regardless of your size or theirs. So find somebody who can help you if you need a little guidance on handling all of these issues. And I think you'll be in good shape. So I'm going to turn now to Anne Richardson for our next myth.
Thank you so much, Karsten, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a delight to see so many faces with us here today. So our third myth of the day, as you can see on the screen, is it's better not to spend from the endowment. At ECF, we talk with Episcopal organizations across the country, and sometimes we encounter organizations who talk to us about how they're not spending from the endowment, and this is a sort of point of pride for them. What we try to do in these conversations is, remind folks that an endowment, it's not a reserve fund. You should have a reserve fund. It is very separate from your endowment fund. Your endowment fund is also not emergency funds to save until needed. An endowment should really be set up to enable distributions. Otherwise, what is it for? It reminds me of the verses that we know very well from Matthew 6, where we are advised not to store up treasures for ourselves on earth. Now, of course, Karsten did just remind us that we are required by law to maintain those gifts from donors that come to us as permanent endowment. But if we really want that gift to be that donor's living legacy, then it's our responsibility to invest the funds that they have gifted to us in a way that grows those funds, so then we will have funds to distribute for our mission and ministry. So if you're not expending funds from your endowment, then your endowment isn't yet enabling your mission and ministry. And it is spending on those things that you do, on that very important mission of your church and all of the ministries that you do for those who are members of your church, for your community, and abroad, that shows the impact that your endowment can have on your church. And that can be very inspiring for new donors. So keeping with our theme here of addressing you some questions for reflection, our first question for reflection on this topic is, do you have a written spending policy that aligns with your current investment approach? It's really your spending policy that is the key way that you balance the present and the future. And it's a policy of prudent spending that helps preserve the endowment for the future. And how do you get to that policy of prudent spending? Well, determining the amount that you can prudently spend is a combination of the long-term return expectations for the investment portfolio that your endowment has, taking into account long-term expectations for inflation, and then, of course, the fees that you pay. Generally, prudent spending for an endowment is about 3.5% to 5% of the market value of your endowment. Okay. And then, aligned with this question about your investment approach is, if you are in a diversified portfolio that's in both stocks and bonds, are you spending on a total return basis? In the past, sometimes endowment spending was defined as spending the income only. A stock bond portfolio certainly does generate some income, but it also, over the long term, not every year, certainly not last year, but over the long term, appreciates in value. And a spending policy that is based on the total return takes this into account and can actually enable more money to be available for your mission and ministry, while still prudently maintaining the value of the endowment over the long run, as we are required to do for true endowments. Finally, how are you calculating the distributions that you have coming out of your endowment? Typically, we advise churches to measure the value of your endowment over a multi-year period. That could be 3 years or sometimes 5 years, which enables you to have more consistency in the value of each year's distribution. And then that enables you to plan better for all the amazing things that you are going to spend that distribution on. So to close on this particular myth, I just want to say that spending some of the funds that you have available in your endowment gives you two valuable possibilities. The first is stability in the form of knowing that a certain amount of money is planned to come in. And then the second is the ability to experiment, to try something new, to see how your members respond, and then grow that program to receive its own funding. We know that optimizing endowments to support distributions is more critical than ever because for many churches, other sources of revenue can be flat or declining. So I'll now hand it back to Karsten to take us through myth number 4.
Great. Thank you, Anne. So myth number 4, we are stuck with restrictions on use that do not meet our needs today. So before we go any further, what are examples of restrictions on use? That would be something like this endowment is for music, or this bequest is for Christian education, or these are funds in perpetuity for building maintenance. So do keep in mind that there is also that possible restriction on the amount that you can spend each year. If it is a true endowment, you can spend only a prudent amount each year, but now focusing on restrictions on use. These are the restrictions these are the items that most of us think about when we think about restrictions. It is easy to get unstuck, and you can plan better for the future, always plan better for the future. But just thinking about getting unstuck, here are some suggestions. First, review what those restrictions are. Go back to the source documents. Sometimes, like the game of telephone, things are not, in fact, what you thought they were. There's a lot of habit, convention, custom, received wisdom around church funds. And in fact, we just worked with a church with 12 different endowment funds to clarify whether each one is true or quasi and for what purpose. And now the church has a little bit more flexibility than it initially thought. In fact, I'll note that many churches, I mentioned this on an earlier slide too, but many churches commingle true and quasi funds. So that is an especially important thing to double check. So second, if you're stuck with restrictions on use, go back to the donor if you can and ask for clarification or adjustment. So obviously in many cases, your donor will no longer be living, but in some cases they are. Many people increasingly now today make an endowment gift in 2 parts. Part of the gift is while they are living out of some of their assets, and the remaining gift is at their death. I'm going to ask everybody who's joining the call to mute themselves so that we can all hear one another without background noise. That would be great. Thanks. So it's certainly also possible to go back to a donor's family, perhaps a surviving spouse, perhaps living children, and ask them. And again, in another recent example, living children wrote back to the church collectively affirming a slightly expanded use of endowment funds that the church had requested. So right there, they did have a little bit of donor adjustment. And then the third suggestion, if you are stuck with restrictions, is to think expansively, think in new ways about what meets the restriction. So for example, you may at your church have always spent music endowment funds on a professional choir, a professional musician, perhaps for Sunday services. Perhaps that's no longer what you need or want. It may not just be right at all for the church at this point. You could instead, just as an example, focus on welcoming the surrounding community into your church for music performances. So that's just one example, but there are lots of ways to think creatively about use. I'll note there are also some legal steps that you can take if you find yourself with restrictions that don't work anymore. That is not a topic for this webinar, but it is a possibility. And generally, that's not something to be afraid of. In general, the people who oversee the regulatory side of these funds, they want charities and churches to be able to use endowment funds for mission. So they are, in general, they're very willing to work together with a charity or church to figure out a best use going forward. But in detail, that's for another time. So for now, at your own church, consider these different issues. Have you reviewed the documentation for your restricted funds? Are you able to clarify restrictions with the donor? Can you think in new ways about endowment purpose? Do you have an outside resource to help you with modification if needed? And number 5 there, do you have a plan to prevent undesired restrictions on new funds? If you are setting up a new fund, make sure it has a flexible purpose, or make sure that the donor's intended purpose is as broad as you can make it, but perhaps also build in an alternate use right there in the original documentation, just in case that initial intended use is no longer workable. And if you know that there is someone at your church considering a gift, talk to them upfront, early, often, about a potential purpose and why you prefer a flexible purpose. You never know what the future of a church holds, and you want to be able to meet new ministry needs in new ways over time, while of course preserving the core nature and identity of being a faith community gathered together. So if you have an existing endowment fund and it has a narrow restriction, you can create a new fund right alongside the existing one, a new fund that is more flexible, and then in the future, encourage new gifts into that new fund. And that's the part about planning better for the future. So now back to Anne for one more myth.
Thank you, Karsten. So our last myth of this afternoon is parishioners are not interested in hearing about our endowment. Now, you're probably reading this and thinking, well, of course that's a myth. Yes, I know that parishioners absolutely want to hear about our endowment. So my question then is, why do so few churches talk about their endowments? What I've generally seen is a 1-paragraph mention of an endowment that's buried in the treasurer's report section of the annual report, and then really little or nothing about the endowment in any other church publications or on the church website. I would say that your parishioners want to know much more about your endowment than what's in just an annual report paragraph. And I would say in particular, your parishioners really want to understand 3 things about your endowment. The first is, how does it support your mission and ministry? The second is, what difference has it made? And then the third, of course, very importantly, is how can they make a gift? So on that first thing that your parishioners should understand, how does it support your mission and ministry? You know, at ECF, we work with churches across the country, and we know that churches use endowments for so many wonderful things: to fund their overseas missions, to enable outreach in their community, to maintain their property so its beauty and function are preserved, and to support core church activities like music, worship, and formation. Your parishioners need and want to know what the endowment is supporting at your church in particular. And then in terms of what difference has it made, you know, how your endowment supports your church's mission and ministry is directly connected to impact. The endowment funds that you may have exist today because of the vision and the generosity of those who came before us. So over the time that your endowment has been distributing funds, what difference has it made? With a little homework, this is a story that you can tell and that your parishioners want to hear. In fact, I was just recently talking with a church who had done a little digging on this exact point and was able to articulate a wonderful story about how their endowment had made a difference that inspired others to contribute. And so then on this third topic of how can they make a gift, I said earlier that showing the impact of the endowment can inspire new donors. So do your parishioners know how to make a gift? Have you made it simple for them? Do you ever talk to them about it? And not like, oh yeah, 5 years ago, we had this wonderful luncheon and it was so well attended, but do you talk to them about it regularly, consistently, and in a way that the people who are in your pews today, or and you're watching your online stream, that they know how to be a part of this and how to make a gift? So turning to our questions for reflection, when was the last time that your parishioners heard an impact story about your endowment? This does not have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to require a lot of time or planning. It could be as simple as a periodic short blurb in your email newsletter. Or if you're a church that does offering talks, you could use one of your offering talks to focus on an impact story from your endowment. And then the second question is, have you invited your members to make a gift to the church part of their legacy? Who is better positioned than the church to talk to people about the end of life and about legacy? As Christians, we are a people of hope, and a planned gift is a gift of hope that honors that member's relationship with the community. Again, each of us enjoys the parish homes that we go to today because of the gifts of those who came before us. And I say many times to churches that a parish will have as many resources as its members choose to give it. So if we want our church to be here for others in the future, then we need to invite people to make that legacy gift. And also thinking back to what Karsten shared earlier, it's critical that you have these dialogues about a planned gift now so that you have an opportunity to both understand what the donor desires and also to potentially shape what that donor might decide to give to with information that they may not have. A poor outcome would be to receive a gift for a purpose that just does not fit with what your church does, and then to either have to refuse that gift or to have to engage in negotiations with a family that is grieving. A better outcome would be to have had that conversation in life and then to have come to a mutual decision about the purpose of the gift. So I hope that our comments today have helped to dispel some myths of endowment management that we hear among churches. As Karsten talked about, endowments can help churches of all sizes with their mission and ministry, and governance doesn't have to be complex. At ECF, our sample policies have helped many churches set up governance structures that work for them. Spending from your endowment is, in fact, how your endowment has an impact on your church, and you do have some options if restrictions on use are not meeting your current mission and ministry. And then finally, always and often, we encourage you to talk to your parishioners about your endowment and to do that in a way that is going to resonate within your church context through communication vehicles that make sense for the people that you are talking to every Sunday and in a way that is going to inspire them to give a gift. So now we do invite your questions. I recognize that we're all here in this meeting format, but it can sometimes be a little challenging to people are speaking over each other. So I would ask, if possible, if you could ask your questions by typing them into the chat box that's on the screen. That will make it easier for us. I think we also did get a few questions in advance from attendees, and so I'll ask Karsten if she wants to ask one of those.
Sure. So one of the first questions was just simply, I'm new on my investment committee. There is an endowment in place, but I'm new. We don't do too much of it. Should I, as a new member, where should I start in helping my church with its endowment?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, first of all, you should do what Karsten advised in the beginning, which is understand what the written policies are. So you should ask absolutely to see either the vestry resolutions or to see the investment policy statement, any of the policies that your church has adopted. Give those a quick read so that you have the historical background of what policies are currently governing the endowment that you're now on the committee of. It's also useful to get a copy of the most recent quarterly performance report. Hopefully you are with an investment manager who will provide that to you. That will give you a sense of how your endowment has been doing relative to a comparable market benchmark. And then the final thing I would say is, you should get a sense for what is that distribution, right? How much has your church been distributing from the endowment and what is it used for? As a committee member, people are going to ask you these things in church or at coffee hour or at your next meeting. And what you want to be able to talk to them about is how that endowment is making a difference. So I think getting that information is really critical so that you can represent the endowment well, since we know that, while we're all talking with our church friends, we're also talking to the potential donors to this endowment who are going to help it last into the future.
Yeah, great. Another question, Anne, but I'll just also say in a moment, I'm also getting questions about the slides. So certainly the slides will be available. They'll either be on EPN's website. I think they typically do that next to a link to this recording. We also have all the registrants for this, and we may be able to send the slides to each participant. But I think the questions to ask at your church have some life to them. So I'm glad to hear that they might be helpful. So one question here, it's a little bit complex, but it's if a donor places a restriction on a gift, and the restriction is not to spend principal for a certain period of time, then later the corpus can be spent. What type of an endowment that is? That an endowment initially and then changed to restricted? So one thing I just want to say, and this is why I did want to answer the question. So when I was talking about the different types of endowments, that's sort of the legal conception of endowments. There are sort of in tandem with that, there are accounting concepts that relate to endowments, and the legal ideas and the accounting labeling and terminology are very similar. They are not exactly the same. So sometimes I hear someone asking a question using accounting language, but we're really talking about legally. So yes, an endowment may actually be set aside with the intent that you cannot spend the corpus or the principal for a while. So if you can spend the income, that does create an endowment. And then after a period of time, yes, if you can spend it all, it's no longer a true endowment in that way, but it's sort of, from accounting purposes, it's still restricted. So slightly complex, but good to keep that in mind. Let me just look here.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, so there's one question I saw that came in that says, can a total return basis be used when the donor specified spending income only? Yeah. Do you want to answer that, or am I happy to?
Sure. Yes.
I was going to say, with your legal background, I mean, I've got a good handle on this, but yes, this is covered very much, I think, in the I didn't know if we would get into this today, but many of you know that endowments are governed by the Uniform Prudent Management of Institutional Funds Act, or MIFA, which has been adopted in 49 states. Pennsylvania has not adopted the exact act, but has a similar law. And what they did in inserting that P into the law, that prudence, when they made the changes, was to say that generally restrictions on a fund to spend the income only is what establishes that fund as an endowment, and was not about what you actually can spend. And so Karsten went over earlier, that a permanent endowment is created when a donor tells you that a fund is not wholly expendable on a current basis, which is the legal language. Of course, the donor is never going to say that. What they are going to say is something like spend the income only. That is what establishes it as a permanent endowment, but it's not a direction on the calculation of your spending. And of course, I'll invite Kirsten to correct me on any of that with her greater legal knowledge.
No, that's exactly right. And I think the key thing to take away is, when you have this true endowment because someone has signaled to you, spend income only, that's the loose way, you can spend both income and appreciation. Both income, interest and dividends, and appreciation are valuable sources of return. And you want to be investing in a way that allows you to gain both types of return, right? That's the best broadly diversified long-term investment management. And in exchange for that type of portfolio, you can then spend both income and appreciation. And that's why we have all collectively pivoted to this percentage spending rate. If you spend, say, 4% of your endowment value, that is then capturing both income and appreciation. And it is not just fully permitted, it is the standard set in the law that applies to true endowments.
Mm-hmm. Great.
Let's see here.
Yeah, so just want to confirm again on the slides. So typically, I believe it'll be an email from EPN, the Episcopal Parish Network, which is our host for this webinar. Just unfortunately, Joe couldn't join us today to officially serve as our host, but this is their webinar. I believe they will distribute the slides and the recording afterward to those who have registered.
And any more questions that come to your mind? We're at a good stopping point otherwise.
No, I'm not. Just looking to make sure. It's a little hard to see all these things sometimes. So let me just look here. Oh, is there a size an endowment should be before starting to spend? That's actually a very good question. So yes, I know I said if you're not spending, you're not contributing. I get it. I also get that some churches would like to have a certain amount of money before they distribute. I think that choice is really, up to your church. You certainly can. I mean, once you have those funds set aside as an endowment and invested in a portfolio and growing, you can use that percentage calculation that we've been talking about. So 3.5%, 4.5%, 5%, whatever is appropriate for you, to actually start to distribute. Now, of course, that 3% will be somewhat small, right? It'll be a small amount of money, but it could do something big for your church. Maybe it helps you kick off a new outreach ministry, or maybe it helps you expand your food pantry in a time of need. So you can certainly use that distribution, knowing that your portfolio is going to continue growing because you have invested it in a way that will help it grow over the long term. Now, if you don't necessarily need the funds right now, I think what some churches do is recognize what the distribution is. And then perhaps say, we don't need that distribution. So even though we could take perhaps $1,000 from our endowment this year for spending, we don't have a use for that $1,000 this year. So we'll put it back into the endowment, continue to allow it to grow, but to have the conversation, right? And to show that the committee is thinking about the distribution. I'm certainly aware of endowments, perhaps they invested right before the stock market had a difficult year. That can feel like a difficult time to take a draw. And it can, take a little bit of a different extra time to recover if you do take a draw when the markets are going down. And so perhaps if you don't need it, you choose to pause. But I do want to say there is no absolute minimum or maximum that you need to reach before you can start spending. You should just be aware of what you have available to spend, and then make a decision about whether there's something especially mission oriented, because in the early years of an endowment, that can be a way to get people really excited about what you're doing. We used our distribution this year from the endowment, again, to establish a new outreach mission or to serve the needs of our community after a difficult natural disaster or something like that.
Yeah. And I'll just say, just to follow on that, I think Anne's exactly right. And also, it's that little bit of spending, even if you spend a little bit, that gives you then a story to tell to encourage others. So as you balance out, do we want to gather funds and get to a certain amount, which makes perfect sense, but you might be trading off the ability to say, why, look, our endowment is already making an impact. So just balance those two. A couple quick follow-on questions to this spending. I'll just answer quickly, and then we can go into spending, I'm sure, in great detail in Jacksonville in March. Yes, if you set a 4% spending rate, that is, you're spending, you're not spending 4% of the appreciation income, you're spending 4% of the total account value. The total account value, of course, includes appreciation, and it includes dividends and interest. You don't just pay those automatically out, you gather them and take 4% of the account value. Should the percentage rate be held relatively stable? That's typically a good idea. Probably a good idea to look at it every year and make sure it is in alignment with what you expect the fund to return over the long term. So you ensure that year after year you are spending it prudently, but this is not a number that should jump around year to year unless you dramatically change how you're invested, which probably isn't a good idea. Unless there's something going on at your church that is driving the change. You don't just change for change's sake. So I think that's where we're at. So it's been a wonderful pleasure to see all of you today. That's the upside of meeting on Zoom in a meeting format. We'd be happy to send, we'll make sure you get additional information. Happy to answer follow-on questions. Here is our contact information. I do hope that we see some of you in Jacksonville, Florida in March or in the years to come at other EPN conferences or on other EPN webinars. So many thanks to all of you. We'll be in touch. Thank you again.
Thank you. Yes, it was wonderful to spend the afternoon with all of you. It's always such a joy to have the opportunity to see people from churches and talk to them. And so again, if anything that you've heard today has sparked your interest or generated questions, our contact information is here on the screen and also will be included in the slides that are sent out. So please don't hesitate to get in touch. We're in these roles because we love to talk to churches. So on behalf of the Episcopal Church Foundation and of course the Episcopal Parish Network, thank you for attending our webinar today. Bye all.